Okay, here we go. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's PoE2 trade report. Before we dive into the details, I just wanted to share a couple of quick notes that come with this week's report. The first one is about the reveal of the Dawn of the Hunt release that Grinding Gear Games announced yesterday. During the announcement, they didn't talk about trading in any shape or form. With that, I assume there will not be any changes to the way trading is currently being done in the game. The other thing is that the economy in the new Dawn of the Hunt League might be significantly different from the current economy. All things that will have to become more clear once the league is launched. The second point is about the data maturity of this report. As mentioned last week, the data I use for this report is not older than 3 days. The third and last point that comes with this report is about item levels of the items that you put up for sale. I come to realize that the item levels are more and more important to be successful in your trades. This especially applies to heavy belts, wands, but also to your rings. Items should be of item level 81 or higher. Asking higher prices for lower item level items reduces the chance of successfully selling your items. Please take your item level in account when you put your items up for sale using my proposed prices. Those are the announcements with this week's report. Let's jump into the details. As always, let's first have a look at the details of the Sapphire ring. The Sapphire ring, from an Exalted perspective, is fairly stable. You can see a lot of values ranging from 30 to 60. That's the majority of the offers that you see up for the Sapphire ring. You do see a couple of outliers. We have a couple of 100. We have one of 200. But it's not the majority. The majority lays between 30 and 60. When we look at the Divine side of things, this is an interesting one. Especially for the Sapphire ring, there's a couple of outliers. We see a group of offers being put up for 110, which is obviously completely out of range for this item. There's actually quite a lot of Sapphire rings put up for 4 Divines, which is not crazy, but I think it's still way too high. There's a couple more 110s. There's one of 200 as well. You can ask yourself what the person was thinking to put up a regular Sapphire ring for 200 Divines, but you know, that's what happens. All in all, the majority of the items that are put up for a Divine are put up for 1 Divine. So what does that mean from a median and an average perspective? When we look at the Exalted side, it's fairly stable. The average is 51.6 and the median is 50. So you see that these are very close together, which is basically what the data shows when we just went through it as well. On the Divine side, you see an average of 17.49, which is 17.5, which is obviously driven by people putting their Sapphire ring up for crazy amounts of Divines. The median is 4, which I think is still way too high for a Sapphire ring being put up for a Divine. On both sides, interestingly, the maximum and the minimum number is the same. So for the Exalted, the maximum number is 200 and the lowest number is 1. And the same goes for the Divine side. When we look at the candlestick graphs, this basically comes out exactly as what we just discussed. So from the Exalted point of view, the best range is somewhere between 40 and 60. I actually sold 4 Sapphire rings for 45 Exalted this week fairly quickly. I must note that my initial offer was 50, but I had the feeling that was not very successful. I didn't get a lot of action on it, so I reduced the price to 45 and I sold them within a day. The Divines, we already spoke about it. I think the only viable offer that you can put your Sapphire ring up for a Divine is 1, and I'm not so sure that you will be extremely successful. Let's have a quick look at the weekly trend. From an offers perspective, we see a decrease, especially on the Divine side, which is a logical thing because I don't think a lot of people are really selling their Sapphire rings for Divines. In addition to the weekly trend, this week I also monitored the daily trend. Each day around the same time, I did a measurement to see how many items were up for sale for Exalteds and for Divines to create a consistent view of the daily trend. As you can see for the Sapphire ring, on a daily basis, there's a bit of fluctuation between the offers being put up for sale, but it's not crazy. It's still fairly stable. That's it for the Sapphire ring. Let's have a look at the gold ring. So looking at the gold ring from an Exalted orb perspective, we see that there is quite a lot of outliers. We see a couple of 140, quite a lot of 200, 150, so quite a lot of high numbers. A bunch of 80s, a whole bunch of 200s, and then a couple of low ones as well. So the range of the offers is quite significant on a sample size of 100. When we look at the Divine side of things, when it comes to gold rings being put up for offer, I think this is interesting. So there's quite a lot of ones. There's a couple of outliers. We see a couple of 88s here, but the majority is being put up for 1. we have a couple of 15s, and then a couple of 20s. The other thing I want to highlight with the gold ring offers being put up for divines is that on a sample size of 100, taking a data maturity of 3 days, we don't get a full sample size. So basically what it means is that I think there's less people putting gold rings up for divines, which I think makes sense. That's it for the details. Let's have a look at the average and let's have a look at the median. So when we look at the Exalted, I think we see, especially on the average side, we see the impact of the outliers that we just looked at. So the average for the gold ring from an Exalted perspective is roughly 58, which is really, really high. The median is 20, which is way closer to what I expect if you put a gold ring up for Exalted Orbs. Interestingly, like we just saw, we see the max offers being put up for 200 Exalted Orbs and then the minimum being 1. When we look at the divine side, I think we see the same issue. First of all, like I just mentioned, the sample size is actually not 100 because there was not enough people putting their gold rings up for divines to basically create a full sample size. So the average is just below 10, which from a divine perspective is obviously way too high. The median is 1, which I think is more realistic. I wouldn't advise putting your gold ring up for 1 divine because I think the chance of actually selling it from 1 divine is 0 to none. We do see an outlier of 200 and we obviously see the minimum value being 1, which is the same as the median. We do see the impact of the outliers on the Exalted sides in the candlestick chart. And this is interesting because basically the range that the candlestick chart gives based on the data set is between 5 and 82. I think 82 is way too high. I think the median is probably the value you want to go for. So I would put my gold ring up for around 20, maybe 25 Exalted Orbs. I think we can be quick on the divines. I think the only viable offer to put your gold ring up for a divine is 1. And I would honestly advise against it because I think the chance of you successfully selling your gold ring for 1 divine is very low. When we look at the weekly supply trend, we can actually see the decrease on the divine offers, as you also saw in the data set. We couldn't get a full data set of 100 data points because not enough people are putting their gold rings up for divines. The Exalted offers are fairly stable. Looking at the daily trend, I think from an Exalted perspective, you can see a fairly stable supply with minimal fluctuations. On the divine side, it's a bit more volatile, but I think in general, you can see a decline in gold rings being put up for divines. That's it for the gold ring. Let's look at the breach ring. The breach ring is an interesting one. It seems unpredictable. So you see values ranging from 20 to 50, but there is quite a lot of offers being put up for way higher. So you see there is quite a lot of offers being put up for 120. There's actually one for 550. I don't exactly know what the person was thinking, and it might not even be the highest. Bunch for 100 and 120. 200. I think a couple more reasonable ones around 10, 20, 30, up to 40. Again, a bunch for 100, a bunch for 400, and then a couple more reasonable ones with a couple of exceptions of 200 in the middle. When we look at the divine side, I think this one is interesting as well. There's a lot of offers being put up for 4 or 5, quite a lot for 1 as well, which I think is probably the most reasonable offer that you can do from a divine perspective. There's obviously an outlier of 500. Again, I don't know what the person is thinking when you put a regular breach ring up for 500 divines. So let's have a look at the average and the median for the breach ring. When we look at the average from an Exalted Orb perspective, we're looking at 78, which is, I think, on the higher side. The median is probably more in the range I would expect, which is 50. I think if you put your breach ring up for 50, that's probably a good price to go. If it stays in your stash tab for a long time, I would lower the price a bit. The maximum value is 550, which I think is completely out of the range what is acceptable for putting a breach ring up for sale. The minimum value is 1, which is obviously very low. And the person that put it up for 1 sold this ring probably really quickly. So let's look at the divine side of things. The average from a divine side of offers is 7.4, which I think is, again, on the high side. And we can explain that by the fact that we had quite a lot of outliers in the data set. The median is 1, which I think is the only viable price to put your breach ring up for a divine. The maximum offer on the divines is 500, which is completely outrageous if you ask me. And the minimum value is 1, which is basically the same as the median. And in my opinion, the only viable option to put your breach ring up for a divine. When we look at the candlestick charts, I think this comes out. So from an Exalted perspective, the range is between 20 and 105. I think here you probably want to be between 20 and 50. I think anything above 50 Exalted Orbs, you run the risk of having your breach ring up for sale for a very long time. The Divine side of things is simple. As mentioned in the data set and in the calculations, I think the only viable option to put your breach ring up for a Divine is 1. Looking at the weekly trend and the daily trend, this is where the breach ring becomes interesting. I think the amount of supply of breach rings being put up for trade is very volatile. Especially on a daily basis, it fluctuates quite heavily. But let's look at the weekly supply trend first. As you can see from an Exalted perspective, it's fairly stable. It hovers more or less around 1,000 offers being put up. When we look at the Divine side, I think you see the volatility. Between the first report and last week's report, I think it was fairly stable, but then you see a spike in supplies being put up this week. So actually the offers being put up for Divines is actually overtook the amount of offers being put up for Exalted, which is crazy if you ask me. When we look at the daily graph, you actually see the volatility, especially on the Divine side. It basically spikes from somewhere between 800 to 400 and then again to nearly 1,500. Those fluctuations happens nearly on a daily basis. So I don't know what is causing that, but there is a lot of volatility in the breach ring supplies. I think the Exalted side of daily supplies is more stable, but still fairly volatile compared to some of the other items that we looked at. That's it for the breach ring. Let's have a look at the Stellar Amulet. So the Stellar Amulet is one of the more valuable items in the list. And you can clearly see that in the values that we see back in the Exalted offers. As you can see, an offer of 400, 400, 460 is light greenish in the data column, which basically means that it's below the median or below the average. So imagine that, right? We have a couple of high values. We see 600, a couple of 550. As said, around 450, 500 is being either considered cheap or more or less on spot, which is interesting. Then we have a couple of higher ones. We have a couple of 600, a couple of 700s, then a couple of 460s and 500s, which, as said, those look for more or less to fit in the range. And then at the end of the data set, we have a whole bunch of 600s, which will obviously influence the average. Let's have a look at the Divine side first. I think most people are trying to sell their Stellar Amulet for Divines, which makes sense. However, how many Divines is obviously the question here. So we see a couple of 1s, then we have a whole bunch of 12 and 13s, which I think is significantly on the high side. A couple more 1s, a couple more 2s and 4s. Here we see 2 offers being put up for 100, which is absolutely an outlier in this matter. Again, I don't understand if people think they're going to be successful if they put a regular Stellar Amulet up for 100 Divines. I think the item will be in your stash tab for a very long time. Couple more 1s, and then here you see a long list of offers being put up for 2, 3, 4, a couple more 2s. So 2 is, I think, what you see the most. So let's have a look at the average and the median calculations. On the Exalted side, we see actually the average laying very closely to the median. So the average is 518 and the median is 500. If I would put my Stellar Amulet up for sale for Exalted, I would probably try 500. You can see that the max value that they are being put up for is 700, which I think is there's not a lot of people that did that. And then the lowest is 50. So I think the person that put it up for 50 is probably going to sell his amulet really, really quickly, because you can actually buy that one and then put it back up the market for a higher price and make a profit. When we look at the Divine side of the offers, we see an average of 5.6, nearly 5.7, and a median of 2. I think the average is basically being inflated by the fact that there is a couple of outliers. We had this list of 13s and 12s, which obviously have an impact on the average. I don't think that's a clear representation of what a Stellar Amulet would go for. We have a median of 2 with a maximum value of 100. We saw those two offers being put up for 100, and the minimum is 1. So the debate for the Stellar Amulet being put up for Divines is between 1 and 2, if you ask me. Are you gonna go with the median median and try to sell your Stellar Amulet for 2 divines? And do you have the patience? Or do you want to sell it quickly and just put it up for 1 divine? That's basically up to you. So let's have a look at the graphs. I don't think we see anything surprising here based on what we just discussed from the details and from the different calculations. The low end of the range starts at 487 and the high end of the range stops at around 600. So somewhere in between that, you can pick a value and sell your Stellar Amulet for from an Exalted Orb perspective. Looking at the divines, as said, I think this is fairly simple. You obviously in the dataset saw a couple of outliers. I think the decision that you need to make to sell your divine is either being patient and put it up for 2, or, you know, if you're less patient, put it up for 1 and likely sell it quicker. Looking at the weekly supply trend, we can see a small decrease in offers being put up for divines, and we can actually see a steep increase for offers being put up for Exalted. When we look at the daily supply trend report, we actually see a similar view as we saw with the breach ring. From a divine perspective, I think it's fairly stable. At the beginning of the week, we saw a daily decrease of offers being put up for divines, but from Wednesday to Friday, we saw a fairly stable supply of Stellar Amulets. On the Exalted side, it's more volatile. Beginning of the week, we saw a small decrease and then a very strong spike of offers being put up for Exalted Orbs, which corrected itself again today. That's it for the Stellar Amulet. Let's have a look at the Heavy Belt. The Heavy Belt is an interesting item. I have sold an enormous amount of Heavy Belts, but lately I've not been very successful in selling my Heavy Belts. So from an Exalted perspective, you see offers being put up somewhere between 10, 20, 50, 60, which are already considered on the high end, 25, whole bunch of 1s. And then we have a couple of outliers. So we have a couple of offers being put up for 100, an offer being put up for 200, but you see quite a lot of offers being put up for around 20, 25, 20, 10. So I think that's probably the range that we want to look at. From a divine perspective, I think we're seeing the same thing as we saw in the gold ring. I believe the data set is not complete for the heavy belts being put up for divines, which means not enough people are putting their heavy belt up for a divine, which I think makes sense. But let's have a look at this. So we see values of 1. We have 1 of 15, which is considered high, but not the highest. 4, 5 divines, 4 divine, 2 divine, obviously a whole bunch of 1s, 2, 5, 2. And then we have 1, which is a complete outlier of 136 divines. Let's have a look at the calculation before we draw a conclusion. So from an Exalted perspective, we see an average of 18.4 with a median of 10. There's obviously a difference between the two because of the outliers. You can still see the number of 200 on the Exalted offers, which is immediately also the maximum value in the data range. The minimum value from an Exalted perspective is 1. Again, going back to the average and the median, I think the average is too high. Let's start with that. I think even a median that is currently 10 is on the high end. Like I said, I had a couple of heavy belts up for sale. I think I started with 10, I decreased them to 5, and I'm still not selling them. So currently the demand is clearly not as high as it was. That said, looking at the divines, the average is just below 4 divines for a heavy belt. The median is obviously 1. I don't think it's a good idea to put your heavy belt up for sale for a divine at this point. But if you want to do it, I would put it for 1 divine. Let's have a look at the candlestick charts. So from an Exalted perspective, it actually represents the range that I would expect to see. So this is more or less following expectations. So the range, the low end of the range is 1, the high end is 20. I would probably try around 5 and see how long it takes for them to sell at this point. If they don't sell, you can obviously decrease the price. I currently have a couple up for sale that are not selling. And I have them for sale for around 5, like I said. So I don't think 20 is a realistic value to put your belt up for sale. Again, divines, we don't really have to look at it. As said before, I think the only viable offer you can do here is 1 divine. And I think the chance of success is slim to none. So let's have a look at the weekly supply trend. As you can see, from an Exalted perspective, we see a week-on-week decrease on offers. On the divine side, we see a small decrease against last week. But I'm very curious how many people are actually selling heavy belts for divines. When we look at the daily supply trend, we see that the Exalted offers for heavy belts is fairly volatile. So there's increases and decreases which are not predictable during the course of the week. With that said, over the last 3 days, we saw a decrease of offers being put up for Exalted Orbs. On the divine side, what we see from a daily trend perspective matches with our data set. So we see less offers being put up for divines. There's a decline on a day-by-day basis, which basically matches with our data set, which is not even a full data set. Again, I think the only conclusion we can draw here is that your heavy belt should be put up for Exalted. I don't think putting your heavy belt up for a divine is a viable option. That's it for the heavy belts. Let's have a look at the first of the wands, the Attuned wand. So the Attuned wand is one of my favorite regular items to sell. The values from an Exalted perspective that you see are very much in line with what I'm seeing on the market. So we see a couple of higher values at the beginning of the data set, 40, 50, which are light pink, so they're not even the highest. Then we see a quite big number of 20s and 25s, which I think is the right amount to ask for an Attuned wand. A couple of low ones, a couple of high ones as well. We see 80 here, a couple of low ones, 15, 20. And then we go into an outlier here. We see an offer being put up for 400, which is obviously completely out of the range. And then a couple more that either are on the low end or are more or less within the range. At the end of the data set, we still have a couple of outliers. We see a couple of offers being put up for 100 and 99, which is more or less the same, and a couple more for 80. But I think what you can see on this data is that the right range to be in is somewhere between 20 and 30. Let's have a look at the divines. I think in the divines it immediately stands out that there is a person putting Attuned wands up for 88 divines. Again, I'm curious how successful the person is going to be with selling his regular Attuned wands for that kind of currency. Let's have a closer look at the rest. So the rest is lower values, right? So we see ones, we see two, a couple of twos, a couple of fives, 10 and an 11 here, more ones, and then we have a couple of 11s towards the end. The other thing is that, as you can see, the dataset for Attuned wands being put up for divines is not complete. That basically translates to less people put their Attuned wand up for sale for divines, which I think makes sense. So let's have a look at the average and the median. So from an Exalted side, we basically see an average of 31.45, which I think is already on the higher end. That's probably driven by the outliers that we saw in the data set. From a median perspective, we're on 20, which I think is more or less the sweet spot. 20, 25, 30 if you're very patient. I think that's probably the price you want to go for if you put up your Attuned wand for Exalted orbs. We have that one outlier of 400, which is immediately also the maximum number in the data set, and then we have a couple of ones. Again, the divines is fairly simple. The average is 12.2, which is obviously driven by the outliers. We see a median of 1, which again, if you put your Attuned wand up for sale for a divine, I think 1 is the only viable option. Let's have a look at the candlestick charts. So from an Exalted perspective, we see exactly what we expected to see. Based on the data set. So the range, the low end of the range is 15, the high end of the range is 30. And as said, I think I've sold around 15 or 20 Attuned wands alone for 25 each this week. So I think that's fairly representative. Please keep in mind that those were Attuned wands of item level 81 or higher. Let's have a look at the divine side. I think we don't have to spend a lot of time here. One divine for an Attuned wand is the maximum I think you can ask. What does it look like from a weekly supply and a daily supply trend? On the weekly supply trend for the Attuned wands, we can see a decrease on both the divine and the Exalted side. So less people are putting these kind of wands up for sale. When we look at the daily trend, however, it seems fairly stable with a slight decrease on the Exalted side. Interestingly, in the beginning of the week, we saw an increase of offers being put up for Exalted orbs. However, during the rest of the week, we saw a slight decrease in offers being put up for Exalted orbs. From a divine perspective, we see a fairly stable supply being offered on a day-by-day basis. That's it for the Attuned wands. Let's have a look at the Siphoning wands. The Siphoning wands is fairly similar as the Attuned wands. So let's have a look at the detailed data. You immediately see on the Exalted side of offers that there is a lot of values for 20 and especially a lot of values for 25, which I think is probably the right amount to go for here. There's really a lot. There's like 67 items up for sale for around 25. Then you see a couple of low ones, 2 and 1. Then we see a couple of 50s, just a couple, not a lot. And towards the end of the data set, we see a couple of 80s, which are obviously driving the average up. Let's look at the divines. I think as with the Attuned wands, I think the only viable offer to put a Siphoning wand up for trade is one divine. So let's have a look at the data. We immediately start with 2 10s, which is obviously which is obviously way too high. Then we have a bunch of offers being put up for 88, which I think is, you know, completely out of the range. I see a couple of hundreds completely out of the range, more 88s, then a couple of ones which are more in line, and then at the end of the data set we see a couple of 11s. As what we saw with the Attuned ones, the data set is not complete from a divine offer perspective, which means that less people are putting their Siphoning wand up for sale for divines. Which I think makes sense if you look at the data. So let's look at the calculations. From an Exalted side perspective, the average and the median are more or less the same. We see an average of 24.4 and a median of 25, which is more or less the same. And that's more or less the value that I expect a Siphoning wand to be sold for. The maximum is 80, the minimum is 1, which is what we just saw in the data set. Looking at the divine side, we see a very high average of 13.6, which is obviously driven by those 88s and those couple of hundreds that we saw in the data set. Complete outliers. The median is 1, which I think is the only viable number to put a Siphoning wand up for sale for a divine. The maximum value is 100, we saw that in the data set, and the minimum value is 1 that we saw a lot of in the data set. Let's have a look at the candlesticks. From an Exalted Orb perspective, I think the candlestick is, as you can see, is very small. The low end is more or less 24, the high end is 25. That's obviously driven by the fact that there was one person putting up, I think, around 65 Siphoning wands for 25, which obviously drives this range. I do think this is the right value actually to put your Siphoning wand up for sale for. So I do think anything above 25 is probably going to make it more difficult to sell your Siphoning wand. Let's look at the divine side. I think the candlestick chart of the divine offers is being messed up a bit by those outliers. There were so many outliers of 88 and 100 that it basically messes up this graph. You see the low end being 1 divine, the high end being 8. I don't think that's really representative of the reality. I think you can only put your Siphoning wand up for maximum 1 divine, and I think that's even already too high. Let me know if you're actually selling Siphoning wands for more than 1 divine. Or if you can sell them for 1 divine, let me know as well. Looking at the weekly supply trend, we see a decrease on both the Exalted and the Divine side. When we look at the daily supply trend, we see that from an Exalted perspective, offers being put up is fairly volatile, with a light increase at the beginning of the week, then a couple of days of decrease, with an increase again at the end of this week. From a Divine perspective, you can see that the offers being put up for Divines is fairly stable across the week. That's it for the Siphoning ones. That's also it for this week's PoE2 trade report. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, next week is going to be an interesting week running up into the new release of Dawn of the Hunt. Next week I will prepare this report, but after that we will have to see what the economy of the Dawn of the Hunt release will look like and what kind of report would make sense for that economy. Please let me know what you think and if you have any questions, and please let me know if you think I should be covering any other items. I'm really looking forward to the Dawn of the Hunt release, and I'm really curious to see what it will do with the economy. It might also mean that I will have to change the weekly trade report to cover different items because of the new economy. As always, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.